Hello, you mysterious Maltese megaliths, and thank you to Willem Killian for the malt mention introducing Ralphie Review 988, which is part of my world tour, my summer season world whisky tour, which is the first I'm doing. It's taken 14 years I've been doing this channel, and I've never had actually a globe-trotting whisky review before, but it's a sign of the times that the availability of whisky is really coming from places that we never expected to see it from even a few years ago. And in fact, I've recently bought a bottle of Brazilian whisky. So I may introduce that to you at some point. In the meantime, we're going to Tasmania. Now, when you're looking at a world whisky, in other words, a whisky which is non-Scotch, it's not bourbon, it's a grain whisky from anywhere in the world that has been produced in a traditional style. Okay? So it could be column stills, pot stills, but basically it looks like whisky, it tastes like whisky, it's a little bit different, but it's definitely whisky. That's how you can tell. And it's a good idea when you're looking to buy a bottle of whisky from an exotic location that you go onto Google Maps and just look at the geographical location and how green the landscape is. And if you were to go to Australia, you wouldn't find an awful lot of green. But if you go to Tasmania, which is a triangular, upended, triangular shaped island just to the south of Melbourne on the south coast of Australia, in basically a cooler, more rain accessed environment, you'll find the green landscape of Tasmania with fields. They're clearly growing crops, and they also have a number of distilleries. They've had a number of distilleries for quite a few years. However, I've not been reviewing much in the way of Tasmanian whisky in my channel because it is seriously expensive, and unfortunately, after it first arrived in the British market, suddenly from being reasonable whisky, it was being totally overhyped. And the reason I'm now reviewing this particular Tasmanian whisky is because it's a decent whisky actually at a decent price. It's not leaning on too much pretentiousness and trading on a reputation that it doesn't really have or earn in terms of pricing. This is Hellier's Road. It's the peated version. It's bottled at 46.2%, and it says in the back of the label, it's unchill filtered. What's interesting about this, and the reason I'm reviewing it here in Ralphie Review 988, is because it's different to Scotch peated whiskies, which is what I'm familiar with. So I'm familiar with peat from around Scotland, which is wherever you go in Scotland, you're not that far from the coast. Particularly in the west side of Scotland, you're more or less basically on the Atlantic. So if you're in Islay, and if you get an Islay distillery using Islay peat, you get this very salt-laden, briny, maritime style of peat influence. Whereas if you're in the USA and you're using US or Canadian sourced peat, you get something which is a little bit more smoky and toffee-ish, and it's more spicy style of peat. So I've been intrigued to see, well, what is the Tasmanian style of peat? I mean, for all I know, they could be importing peat from anywhere else in the world, despite the fact that it was probably available in Tasmania. But I'm going to take it purely in face value. I can't really dig too deep and basically get forensic about this. I just want to assess in this review the whole experience on smell and taste. Now, the smell, this is a young peated whisky. because it's quite hot on the nose. It'll certainly tone down once I add a little bit of water. But before I do so, I'm going to taste it. Now the nose, gingery, as I said, a little bit hot and toffee-ish. In fact, fudgy. Taste. This is a very minty style of peat influence. The phenolic is very identifiable. It's very familiar. It's very clearly delivered in the palate. So this isn't just a subtly peated whisky from Tasmania. This is a distinctly peated whisky. And I'm going to add a drop of water now, because at the moment, with the soft style of the malt, now I'm adding 1.5 teaspoons here. So that's 6 millilitres. So a fair amount of water. In fact, for many of you watching, a lot of water. But this is what helps you access and get right into a deep dive in terms of the taste and the flavour. And it's taken me a while to get to know this whisky. As you can see, I've been doing quite a bit of research around it. Is it natural colour? I think it may be. If they have added caramel to it, I don't think there's really much at all. I think, judging by the appearance, it's relatively natural. And the reason I say that is because when distillers are adding caramel, they tend to overdo it most of the time, particularly in blended whiskies. So it becomes too dark and orangey, it becomes too fake looking, too much of a tango tan. But in this instance with Hellier's Road, it's not an issue. So I've added the water, it's opening up now. So a little bit of a confession here. This is the second recording of this review. And when I posted the first recording to my Patreon subscribers, which is what I do, 24-hour access, they pointed out, Ralphie, you're telling your audience that Sullivan's Cove whisky and Lark whisky are from New Zealand, but they're actually Tasmanian distilleries. There we go. A blooper. So I've re-recorded this entire review to make sure you get the facts, in my opinion. Interestingly, thank you to Damo, who's a pal, for also letting me know, because he lives in Tasmania. You see, that's very handy, because you can't beat local knowledge. And he basically says there are now over 80 whisky distilleries in Tasmania. 80. That's phenomenal. It's going to be really interesting to see where this goes, because I have tried Sullivan's Coves and I've tried Lark, and there was a huge amount of fanfare when Lark Distillery first appeared in the UK. In fact, at one point, the owner of Lark Distillery came over to look into setting up a distillery in Scotland, or be part of setting up a distillery in Scotland, but it never worked out. But that was a few years ago, and my goodness, how things have changed. 80 distilleries. I don't think that even half of these distilleries can charge Sullivan Cove prices, which is a distillery that started off really badly. But then when they sorted it out, they're still set up, producing really good whisky. So we know the provenance of whisky from Tasmania is really sound, really good, loads of personality. However, one of the initial problems we've had is the sheer outrageous prices of Tasmanian whisky, and also the habit that some Tasmanian distillers have had of bottling in 50 centilitre bottles instead of 70. There we go. And are we adding on from Willem Killian, who provided the malt mention, another little comment on my Patreon page. Unfortunately, Australian whiskies are extremely rare, because Australia is really set up for brandy, having a big wine industry, and for rum, where sugarcane can grow and be easily imported from other parts of the South Pacific. But hang about, I've got that completely wrong. Right, thank you to Willem Killian, who's in South Africa, right, and is mentioning that Australian whiskies are extremely rare and virtually non-existent in South Africa. However, I think that will change. Oops. And it's RK, thank you to RK, who mentions that Sullivan's Cove and Lark, two of the most overrated and overpriced whiskies, both from Tasmania. Lark especially with its 500ml bottles and quote unquote, not my opinion, but the Pat Pal's opinion by Patreon supporter, gimmicky releases. Okay, I'm not going to argue with that. But just to conclude with Willem. Willem is in South Africa and is in fact first access to Australian whisky, which is Starward whisky, is coming through the independent Scotch whisky bottlers. So here's a reminder yet again of how important independent bottlers are for regionality and for getting identity out into the wider world market. So any distillery can be, doesn't have to be any particular distillery or even a small group of distillers in Tasmania, group together or do it yourself, start an independent bottling company specifically for Tasmanian whisky, and it lets people taste and try globally before they start to commit to official bottlings from distilleries. We see this happening with JJ Corey, bottlers in Ireland, doing a wonderful, a very valuable job. Anywhere where you are, having an independent bottler to take permutations and versions of your regional style out into the wider world is extremely helpful, in my opinion, for what it's worth. Back to Hellier's Road. I've given it a good 10 minutes now, really. The nose settling down nicely. Young, youthful, but not harsh, not fierce. Taste. Spicy, aromatic, cough mixture and fudgy phenolics. So the peatiness is coming across differently from what you find in Scotch whisky. It's much more cereal, fudge, soft toffee style of peat, and that makes this interesting. What am I going to give it in the way of a malt mark? I think I'm going to give this 82 out of 100, which is a good deed. It's over 80, so that's decent, and it's a malt mark. It's technically an Australian malt mark, but I regard Tasmania as its own specific geographical global region. I do not regard Tasmania as part of Australia in terms of whisky, although it is part of Australia in terms of nationality or national affiliation. End of. So thank you for watching my review, and a big thank you to my Patreon subscribers who have corrected my major blooper, allowing me time to completely record a fresh new video to release to all you whisky fans. So I hope you appreciate it, hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, leave a comment, click subscribe, etc. See you soon.